The mahogany conference table at Morrison & Associates gleamed under the soft lighting, reflecting the faces of 5 people whose presence would determine the next chapter of my life. Victoria sat across from me in her signature red power suit, flanked by 2 attorneys whose hourly rates probably exceeded most people's monthly mortgage payments. Her posture radiated the confidence that had first attracted me 15 years ago, back straight, chin tilted at that slight angle that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way. Beside me sat Patricia Brennan, the unassuming woman in her late 50s who had handled my family's legal matters for over a decade. Her understated appearance, simple navy blazer, minimal jewelry, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, contrasted sharply with Victoria's theatrical presentation. But Patricia's reputation in family law was formidable, built on meticulous preparation rather than courtroom dramatics. "Before we begin," Victoria's lead attorney announced, adjusting his silk tie with practiced authority, "my client wishes to state for the record that she approaches these proceedings with genuine sadness. Mrs. Morrison has no desire to make this process adversarial." I managed not to laugh at the performance. Just last week, my assistant had overheard Victoria at our country club telling her tennis partner that divorcing me would be like taking candy from a baby, that I was too weak to fight for anything significant, that the prenuptial agreement would ensure she came out ahead no matter what. Victoria had always underestimated me. During our marriage, my quiet approach to problem-solving had often been mistaken for passivity. While she commanded attention with her forceful personality and dramatic gestures, I preferred to work methodically, carefully, behind the scenes. It was a difference in style that had complemented our relationship for years, until her contempt for what she perceived as weakness had grown into something toxic. "Mrs. Morrison is prepared to be generous," her attorney continued, sliding a document across the polished table. "This proposed settlement offers Mr. Morrison substantially more than the prenuptial agreement requires, demonstrating her commitment to an amicable resolution." I didn't need to review the document to know it would be insulting, probably the minimum required by law, presented as magnanimity. Victoria had spent months preparing for this moment, consulting with high-priced attorneys, strategizing about how to maximize her share of our substantial assets while minimizing mine. Patricia opened the folder beside her with the deliberate care that had always characterized her work. "Before we review Mrs. Morrison's proposal," she said quietly, "perhaps we should examine the prenuptial agreement itself. I've had some concerns about certain provisions that warrant clarification." Victoria's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been apprehension before her confident mask reasserted itself. She couldn't possibly know what Patricia had discovered 3 weeks ago during her review of our 15-year-old prenup. The clause Victoria had never bothered to read carefully, the one that would redefine everything. Victoria's attorney, Bradford Sterling, accepted the prenuptial agreement from Patricia with the casual confidence of someone who assumed he already knew its contents. "Of course, we're well aware of the prenup's provisions," he said, not bothering to open the document. "They're quite clear regarding asset protection and division in the event of divorce." "Interesting," Patricia replied with her characteristic understatement. "Which specific provisions are you referring to, Mr. Sterling?" The question was innocent enough, but I recognized the tactical precision behind it. Patricia never asked questions she didn't already know the answers to. Sterling's expression remained confident as he gestured broadly. "The standard protections for premarital assets, limitations on spousal support duration, and the morality clauses regarding grounds for dissolution." Victoria nodded approvingly, clearly pleased with her attorney's summary. She caught my eye across the table and offered a slight smile. Not warm, but satisfied, the look of someone who believed victory was assured. "Perhaps you could be more specific about the morality clauses," Patricia suggested, opening her copy of the prenup to a page marked with several yellow tabs. "Since those provisions are particularly relevant to your client's position." Something in Patricia's tone made Sterling actually open his copy of the document, scanning the relevant section with what I began to recognize as growing concern. "The standard adultery provisions," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Protecting both parties in the event of marital misconduct." "Ah, yes, Section 7.3, Patricia said, her finger tracing the relevant paragraph. "The section that states, and I quote, In the event that either party engages in extramarital relationships during the marriage, said party forfeits all claims to spousal support and receives only those assets they brought into the marriage, with no claim to assets acquired jointly during the marriage. Victoria's face went pale. Sterling continued reading, his complexion taking on an increasingly grayish hue. Of course, Patricia continued conversationally. That clause would only be relevant if such relationships had occurred. Unless, Mr. Sterling, you're aware of any such circumstances. The conference room fell silent, except for the barely audible hum of the building's ventilation system. Victoria's eyes had fixed on the prenup in front of her attorney, as if seeing the document for the first time. We would need to review the specific language more carefully, Sterling managed, his earlier confidence evaporating. By all means, Patricia agreed graciously. Take your time. While you're reviewing, perhaps you'd also like to examine Section 4.2, which addresses the circumstances under which premarital asset protections become void. Sterling's hands trembled slightly as he flipped to the referenced section. Victoria leaned over to read along, her face growing progressively paler. I had signed that prenuptial agreement 15 years ago at Victoria's insistence, told it was just a formality to protect assets we had each brought into the marriage. At 28, I had been focused on Victoria's beauty and ambition, trusting her attorney's explanation of the document's purpose without carefully examining its provisions. What I hadn't realized until Patricia's recent review was that the attorney who had drafted it, Victoria's own family friend, had included standard reciprocal protections that Victoria had apparently never bothered to understand. She had focused only on how the agreement would protect her substantial inheritance and business interests, never considering how those same provisions might work against her if circumstances changed. There seems to be some confusion about the prenup's actual terms, Patricia observed with gentle understatement. Perhaps we should clarify the relevant provisions before discussing any settlement proposals. She opened a second folder, this one containing what I knew to be documented evidence of Victoria's ongoing affair with Marcus Henley, the investment banker she had met at a charity gala 8 months ago. Phone records, hotel receipts, photographs taken by the private investigator Patricia had retained after Victoria's behavior became increasingly suspicious. Mr. Sterling, Patricia said quietly, I believe we need to have a more comprehensive discussion about your client's position in these proceedings. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted dramatically as the true implications of our prenuptial agreement became clear. Victoria sat rigidly beside her legal team, her earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled panic as Sterling continued reading through provisions she had clearly never fully understood. Perhaps we should take a brief recess, Sterling suggested, his professional composure strained. My client and I need to discuss these revelations privately. Of course, Patricia agreed graciously. We'll be here when you're ready to continue. As Victoria's team filed out of the conference room for their emergency consultation, I remained seated beside Patricia, still processing the dramatic reversal of our positions. An hour ago, I had entered this meeting expecting to negotiate from weakness, perhaps managing to salvage some dignity and fair access to my son amid Victoria's anticipated financial dominance. How did you know? I asked Patricia quietly. About her affair, I mean. When did you start investigating? Patricia's expression was thoughtful as she organized her files. About 6 months ago, you mentioned that Victoria was working late more frequently, traveling for business meetings that didn't align with her usual client schedule. Given the financial implications of the prenup's morality clauses, I thought it prudent to verify whether those explanations were accurate. Her professional caution had proven prescient in ways I hadn't anticipated when I'd casually mentioned Victoria's changed patterns during a routine legal consultation about updating our wills. The private investigator you retained, was that expensive? I asked, curious about the practical aspects of the protection Patricia had arranged without my explicit knowledge. Considerably less than what you would have lost if Victoria's initial strategy had succeeded, she replied pragmatically. And given the strength of the evidence we've gathered, the investigation expense becomes a minimal cost for significant protection. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see Victoria and her attorneys in animated discussion in the hallway. Victoria's gestures had become increasingly agitated, her hands moving in sharp, quick motions that I recognized as signs of her growing frustration and anger. What do you think they're discussing? I wondered aloud. Damage control, Patricia said simply. Sterling is probably explaining that their client's position has just shifted from aggressive prosecutor to vulnerable defendant. They'll need to completely recalibrate their strategy. As if summoned by her words, the opposing team returned to the conference room. Victoria's face was carefully composed, but I could see the strain around her eyes, the tight control of someone working hard to maintain dignity in a situation that had spiraled beyond her management. We'd like to make a counter-proposal, Sterling announced, his earlier theatrical confidence replaced by measured professionalism. Given the complexity of the prenuptial agreement's provisions, perhaps a negotiated settlement would serve everyone's interests better than strict enforcement of its terms. Patricia raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. My client is prepared to offer Mr. Morrison 60% of the marital assets, continued residence in the family home, and primary custody of their son. In exchange, we would ask for discretion regarding any personal matters that might otherwise become part of the public record. The proposal represented a complete reversal of Victoria's opening position. From offering me minimal assets and limited parenting time, she was now proposing to give me majority control of our joint estate and our son's living arrangements. That's a significant shift from your client's initial position, Patricia observed mildly. May I ask what prompted this reconsideration? Victoria finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled. I've always believed in fair negotiations, Ms. Brennan. Perhaps my initial proposal was too conservative. The euphemism would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Victoria's conservative initial proposal would have left me with barely enough assets to rent a modest apartment while she retained our mansion, our vacation home, and primary custody of our 8-year-old son. We'll need to review this new proposal carefully, Patricia said, making notes. However, I should mention that my client has his own thoughts about appropriate terms, given the circumstances that have come to light. She opened her final folder, revealing documents I hadn't seen before. Mr. Morrison has been considering the impact of these proceedings on their son, and he has some specific requirements that would need to be addressed in any settlement discussion. I leaned forward slightly, curious about what Patricia had prepared. We had discussed my priorities extensively, maintaining a close relationship with my son, preserving enough financial stability to provide for his future, and ensuring Victoria's behavior didn't negatively impact his emotional development. Mr. Morrison proposes the following, Patricia began, reading from her notes. Primary physical custody of their son, with Mrs. Morrison having standard visitation. Retention of the family home to provide stability for the child. An equitable division of marital assets based on actual contributions, with appropriate consideration for any violations of the prenuptial agreement's morality clauses. Victoria's jaw tightened as Patricia continued. Additionally, Mr. Morrison requires absolute confidentiality regarding the reasons for divorce in all communications with their son, extended family, or mutual acquaintances. Any public disparagement or discussion of private marital matters would result in modification of custody arrangements. The provision about confidentiality was particularly important to me. Victoria's tendency to share intimate details with her social circle, including apparently her dismissive comments about my supposed weakness, needed to be curtailed to protect both our son's emotional well-being and my own professional reputation. Those terms seem quite favorable to your client, Sterling observed, clearly recognizing that the power dynamic had shifted completely from their expectations. They reflect the reality of the situation, Patricia replied simply. Mrs. Morrison's affair has triggered specific contractual consequences that she agreed to 15 years ago. We're simply seeking to implement those provisions fairly while prioritizing the child's best interests. Victoria's face had gone from pale to flushed, anger finally breaking through her composed facade. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice rising slightly. You can't seriously expect me to accept such punitive terms based on trumped-up accusations. The accusations are well documented, Mrs. Morrison, Patricia replied calmly, gesturing to the investigative files. And the terms I've outlined are considerably more generous than strict enforcement of your prenuptial agreement would require. She opened to a specific page of the document Victoria had insisted we sign. According to Section 7.3, which you just had read aloud, adultery results in forfeiture of spousal support and claims to jointly acquired assets. What we're proposing allows you to retain significant marital property despite this contractual violation. The stunning reversal of our positions, from Victoria's confident assumptions about my weakness to her current defensive scrambling, would have been satisfying if not for the pain underlying it all. This was still the mother of my child, the woman I had once loved enough to build a life with. But she had made choices that brought us to this moment. And now we would all live with the consequences of those choices, including the prenuptial agreement she had never bothered to read completely. After another tense recess, Victoria's team returned with a dramatically different demeanor. Sterling's earlier theatrical confidence had been replaced by the subdued professionalism of someone managing a crisis rather than prosecuting a victory. "We've had an opportunity to thoroughly review the prenuptial agreement," he began carefully. "My client acknowledges that certain provisions may have been overlooked in our initial assessment." Patricia nodded with the gracious magnanimity of someone who had just watched their opponent's strategy collapse. "We appreciate that acknowledgement. It's always best when all parties have a clear understanding of the applicable legal framework." Victoria, who had remained silent during their strategy session, finally spoke. "I'd like to address my husband directly, if I may." The formality of her request, "my husband," rather than simply using my name, struck me as an attempt to invoke whatever personal connection might still influence my decision-making. Patricia glanced at me for confirmation. I nodded, curious what Victoria would say when stripped of legal maneuvering and forced to speak directly. "Nathan," she began, her voice softer than it had been all morning, "I know you're hurt. I know my choices over the past year have damaged our marriage in ways that may be irreparable. But we have a son together. We have 15 years of shared history. Destroying each other serves no purpose except revenge." Her appeal was skillfully crafted, acknowledging wrongdoing while positioning any enforcement of the prenup's consequences as vindictive rather than contractually appropriate. "I'm not interested in destroying anyone," I replied evenly. "I'm interested in protecting our son and ensuring his stability during this transition. Your affair has already disrupted his sense of family security. How we handle this divorce will determine whether that damage is temporary or permanent." Victoria leaned forward slightly, pressing her advantage. "Exactly my point. A contentious divorce with public accusations and punitive settlements would traumatize him far more than an amicable separation based on mutual respect. Which is why I'm not requesting enforcement of the full penalties available under the prenuptial agreement," I said, gesturing to Patricia's proposed terms. "What I've outlined is significantly more generous than strict application of the morality clauses would require." Victoria's expression flickered with confusion. "Full penalties? What do you mean?" Sterling looked up sharply from the document he'd been studying, his face now completely pale. He leaned over to whisper urgently in Victoria's ear, but she pushed him away. "What full penalties?" she demanded, her composure finally cracking completely. Patricia opened to a section of the prenup marked with multiple tabs. "Section 7.3, subsection C," she read aloud. "In the event of proven adultery, the offending party forfeits all claims to marital property and retains only those assets brought into the marriage, plus any gifts specifically designated as separate property." Victoria stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. "That can't be right. My attorney assured me the prenup was standard, just basic asset protection." "It is standard," Patricia confirmed. "Standard language for a comprehensive marital agreement designed to protect both parties. The section you're apparently just discovering was included at your own attorney's recommendation 15 years ago." I watched my wife's face as the full implications sank in. She had insisted on the prenuptial agreement, claiming it was just practical, given our significant assets and high-profile careers. She had pushed for its signing despite my ambivalence, assuring me it was just paperwork that would never be relevant. Now, that same document, which she had treated as a weapon to use against me, was revealing itself as a protection I had unknowingly secured 15 years earlier. This is why your client's initial characterization of Mr. Morrison as too weak to fight for his interests was particularly ironic. Patricia continued with gentle precision. "Mr. Morrison has been protected by contractual provisions your client herself insisted upon, provisions that now significantly favor his position. Sterling was frantically reviewing the document, apparently recognizing for the first time the magnitude of his client's miscalculation. "We'll need time to fully assess these provisions," he said, his voice strained. "Certainly," Patricia agreed. "Though I should mention that Mr. Morrison has been quite clear about his priorities. A stable home environment for their son, fair division of marital assets, and protection from any further disparagement of his character or capabilities. The prenuptial agreement simply provides leverage to ensure these reasonable requests are taken seriously." As Victoria's team once again retreated for crisis management, I reflected on the strange circularity of our situation. The woman who had spent months telling friends I was too weak to stand up for myself had inadvertently created the legal framework that now protected me from her own predatory intentions. "How are you feeling?" Patricia asked quietly once we were alone. "Honestly, a little overwhelmed," I admitted. 6 hours ago, I was preparing to negotiate for scraps. Now you're in a position of strength that your wife created herself," Patricia finished. "Sometimes justice arrives through unexpected channels." When Victoria's team returned after their extended consultation, the transformation was complete. Sterling's theatrical confidence had been replaced by the grim professionalism of damage control, while Victoria herself looked genuinely shaken for the first time in our marriage that I could remember. "We'd like to propose a revised settlement framework," Sterling began, his voice notably subdued. "One that acknowledges the full scope of the prenuptial agreement's provisions, while seeking an equitable resolution that serves everyone's interests, particularly the welfare of the minor child." Patricia nodded encouragingly. "We are always open to reasonable proposals. My client is prepared to accept a 60-40 division of marital assets in Mr. Morrison's favor, voluntary relinquishment of primary custody, and a structured settlement that allows her to maintain appropriate housing while Mr. Morrison retains the family home." The complete reversal of Victoria's opening position, from claiming the majority of our assets to accepting a minority share, represented capitulation so total it was almost dizzying. "We appreciate Mrs. Morrison's newfound flexibility," Patricia replied diplomatically. "However, my client has additional concerns that need addressing before we can consider any settlement." She consulted her notes. "Given the documented pattern of disparagement, including Mrs. Morrison's public statements about Mr. Morrison's character at social gatherings, we require specific provisions preventing any future negative commentary about him to their son, family members, or mutual acquaintances." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I've never said anything inappropriate about Nathan to our son." "That may be true," Patricia acknowledged, "but you have made disparaging remarks to others that could easily reach him or affect his father's reputation in the community. The goal is prevention of future incidents, not punishment for past ones." I watched Victoria struggle with this constraint on her freedom to control narratives, something she had always done effortlessly through charm, social connections, and the force of her personality. "What else?" she asked tersely, apparently recognizing that her bargaining position had deteriorated beyond salvage. "A structured parenting plan that prioritizes stability for your son, while ensuring both parents remain actively involved in his life," Patricia continued. "Mr. Morrison proposes that you maintain significant parenting time, weekends and Wednesday dinners, while he provides the primary residence and handles weekday logistics. And if I refuse these terms?" Victoria asked, a hint of her old defiance returning. Patricia's expression remained sympathetic but firm. "Then we would request the court to enforce the prenuptial agreement as written. Based on the documented evidence of adultery, that would result in Mrs. Morrison receiving only the assets she brought into the marriage, approximately $230,000, while forfeiting all claims to the jointly acquired estate valued at just over $3 million. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria's inheritance, substantial when we married, represented less than 10% of the wealth we had accumulated together over 15 years. Her affair with Marcus Henley had potentially cost her approximately $7 million, plus the family home, plus primary custody of our son. "I need to discuss this with my client privately," Sterling said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Patricia replied. "We'll wait in the lobby." As we gathered our materials and moved toward the door, Victoria finally spoke directly to me for the first time since the proceedings began. "Nathan," she said, her voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Was this your plan all along? To use the prenup against me like this?" I paused at the conference room door, considering how to respond to this question that revealed so much about her mindset. The assumption that protection of my own interests was somehow an attack on hers. "Victoria, you insisted on that prenuptial agreement despite my reservations. You had it drafted by your own attorney. You pushed for its signing over my objections." I met her gaze directly. "I never wanted to use it at all, but when you decided to have an affair and tell your friends I was too weak to defend myself, you created this situation, not me." "That's not," she began, then stopped herself. "The truth is, I would have preferred to work out our divorce amicably, without prenups or investigations or legal leverage," I continued. "But you made that impossible when you chose to approach this as a conquest rather than a partnership dissolution." Her face flushed with what might have been shame or anger. I could no longer distinguish between her authentic emotions and her strategic performances. "Your attorney will explain the mathematics to you," I said, reaching for the door handle. "But I hope you'll also consider the impact on our son. He deserves parents who can coexist respectfully, not two people locked in a battle where everyone loses except the lawyers." As Patricia and I waited in the lobby, she observed quietly, "That was well handled. Firm, but not vindictive. Setting clear boundaries while leaving room for more reasonable negotiations." I nodded, though I felt no satisfaction in Victoria's reduced circumstances. The woman who had characterized me as too weak to fight was learning that strength sometimes manifests as patience, preparation, and principled response rather than aggressive posturing. The prenup clause she had never bothered to read was about to teach her that the most dangerous adversaries are often those who appear most accommodating, until they're forced to defend what truly matters to them. The final settlement conference took place 3 weeks later in Judge Morrison's chambers. No relation to Victoria despite the shared surname, a fact that had required verification given our recent experience with judicial connections. Judge Morrison, a woman in her early 60s with salt and pepper hair and penetrating blue eyes, had a reputation for cutting through emotional manipulation to focus on practical solutions that protected children above all else. "I've reviewed the prenuptial agreement, the settlement proposals from both parties, and the investigative materials submitted by Mr. Morrison's counsel," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of family dissolutions. "This is an unusual case in several respects. Victoria sat beside her new attorney. Sterling had withdrawn from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with his client, though gossip suggested Victoria's refusal to accept reality had made effective representation impossible. Her replacement, Jennifer Walsh, was known for practical approaches to difficult divorces rather than theatrical courtroom battles. "Your Honor," Walsh began, "my client acknowledges certain poor choices in her personal life. However, she maintains that enforcement of the prenuptial agreement's penalties would be disproportionate to the actual harm caused." Judge Morrison studied Victoria directly. "Mrs. Morrison, you signed this agreement 15 years ago. Did you understand its terms at the time?" Victoria straightened in her chair, summoning what remained of her courtroom presence. "I understood the basic protections, Your Honor. I may not have fully considered every hypothetical scenario." "The adultery provisions aren't hypothetical scenarios, Mrs. Morrison. They're specific contractual consequences for specific actions." Judge Morrison's tone was matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "You agreed to these terms when you believed they would protect your interests. Do you now contend they should be unenforceable simply because they work against you?" The direct question exposed the fundamental inconsistency in Victoria's position. The prenup had been her idea, drafted by her attorney, insisted upon despite my objections. Arguing against its enforcement now required her to maintain that contracts should only be honored when convenient. "Your Honor," Victoria said carefully, "I'm simply requesting that the court consider the totality of our marriage and the welfare of our child in making determinations about asset division and custody." Judge Morrison nodded. "I have considered those factors extensively, Mrs. Morrison, which is why I'm approving the settlement Mr. Morrison has proposed, not because the prenuptial agreement requires it, but because it represents a reasonable balance between contractual consequences and the practical needs of your family moving forward." She outlined the terms. I would retain the family home and receive 65% of our marital assets. Victoria would have alternating weekend custody and Wednesday dinners with our son, while I maintained primary custody and decision-making authority for school, medical, and other significant matters. Most importantly, both parties would be bound by strict confidentiality provisions, preventing any public discussion of the divorce circumstances. This arrangement allows Mrs. Morrison to maintain an appropriate lifestyle while ensuring your son's stability, Judge Morrison explained. It acknowledges Mr. Morrison's greater financial contribution to marital assets while providing Mrs. Morrison with sufficient resources to rebuild her life independently. As the judge finalized her ruling, I caught Victoria's expression. Not the rage or humiliation I might have expected, but something closer to resignation mixed with what might have been relief. Perhaps the weight of maintaining her strategic deceptions had been more exhausting than I had realized. Mr. Morrison? Judge Morrison addressed me directly. You've shown remarkable restraint in this situation. The prenuptial agreement would have legally entitled you to significantly more punitive measures. Your willingness to moderate those consequences demonstrates admirable focus on your son's welfare. After the court session concluded and legal formalities were completed, Victoria and I found ourselves alone in the courthouse hallway, our attorneys having tactfully withdrawn to allow for any final personal words we might need to exchange. I underestimated you, Victoria said quietly, her voice lacking its usual commanding presence. For years I thought your patience meant weakness. Your willingness to compromise meant you could be manipulated. Maybe it did sometimes, I acknowledged honestly. But when you threatened my relationship with our son and tried to leave me financially devastated, you discovered that patience has limits. Victoria nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Nathan. Not for wanting to end our marriage, that was probably inevitable, but for how I handled it. You deserved better. The apology, however belated, felt genuine in a way her earlier strategic communications had not. We both deserved better, I agreed. But this is what we have now. Let's try to make it work for our son's sake. As Victoria walked away toward her car, her reduced assets, her weekend custody schedule, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. Her public dismissal of me as too weak to defend myself had been proven spectacularly wrong by the very document she had forced into our marriage. The prenup clause she never read had become the foundation of my protection and her downfall, a reminder that careful preparation and patient strategy often prove more powerful than aggressive posturing and assumptions about others' limitations. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I stood in the kitchen of our home, just mine and 8-year-old Tommy's now during my custodial time, preparing dinner while he worked on homework at the kitchen island. The space felt both familiar and renewed, the oppressive tension that had characterized our final years of marriage replaced by an easier rhythm adapted to our new family configuration. Dad, can you help me with this math problem? Tommy asked, looking up from his worksheet with the serious expression he adopted when facing academic challenges. Of course, I replied, drying my hands before moving to examine the problem. Show me what you've tried so far. As we worked through the solution together, I marveled at how completely our lives had stabilized since those dramatic months of legal proceedings. Tommy had adjusted to the divorce schedule with remarkable resilience, thriving in both households while maintaining a close relationship with Victoria despite her significantly reduced parenting time. Victoria herself had undergone her own transformation in the aftermath of our settlement. The financial consequences of her affair, losing the majority of our marital assets, had necessitated major lifestyle adjustments, including selling her luxury condo and moving to a more modest apartment. Her relationship with Marcus Henley had ended within months of our divorce finalization, apparently unable to survive the transition from exciting affair to mundane reality. Is Mom coming to my baseball game this weekend? Tommy asked, having completed the math problem with minimal assistance. She'll be there Saturday, I confirmed, consulting the shared calendar we maintained for his activities. She mentioned bringing her camera to get pictures of you batting. The casual coordination of co-parenting logistics had become routine. Our communication focused exclusively on Tommy's needs rather than lingering resentments from our marriage's end. Victoria had honored the confidentiality provisions of our settlement, never discussing the specific circumstances of our divorce with Tommy or mutual acquaintances. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Brennan. Saw the Business Journal article about your promotion to Regional VP. Congratulations, well-deserved recognition. The promotion, announced the previous week, represented a career milestone I had worked toward for years. More significantly, it validated the professional capabilities Victoria had so casually dismissed, proving that her assessment of me as too weak had been as misguided as her understanding of our prenuptial agreement. As I prepared our dinner, Tommy's favorite spaghetti and meatballs, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my perspective on strength and weakness had evolved since our marriage ended. Victoria's idea of strength had been about dominance, control, and the ability to impose one's will on others. My approach emphasized patience, preparation, and the strategic application of available resources when protection became necessary. The prenup she had never fully read had ultimately become a perfect metaphor for our contrasting styles. She had focused on its immediate symbolic value as a demonstration of her sophistication and foresight, while I had accepted its presence without fully exploring its implications until circumstances demanded understanding. "Dinner's ready, buddy," I called to Tommy, who abandoned his completed homework with enthusiasm. As we sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where Victoria had once held court, directing conversations and commanding attention, I appreciated the quieter dynamic that had emerged. Tommy chatted about his day with the unself-conscious ease of a child who felt heard and valued, sharing everything from playground interactions to concerns about an upcoming science test. After dinner, as Tommy settled into the living room with a book for his required reading time, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen. Not unusual, as we spoke several times each week about Tommy's activities and schedule coordination. "Hi, Victoria. Everything okay?" "Yes, fine," she replied, her voice carrying the neutral pleasantness that had characterized our interactions since the divorce. "I wanted to give you a heads up that Tommy mentioned your promotion during our phone call last night. He's very proud of you." The simple message, delivered without editorial comment or congratulation, nonetheless felt like an acknowledgement of the professional success that contradicted her earlier dismissive assessment of my capabilities. "Thank you for letting me know," I replied. "How are things going with your new position?" Victoria had recently transitioned to a smaller firm after her previous employer, a high-profile interior design company, had dissolved amid financial irregularities that had nothing to do with our personal situation, but had nonetheless disrupted her career trajectory. "Challenging but good," she said. "Different from what I'm used to, but I'm learning to appreciate the smaller scale and more personal client relationships." The admission that she was learning to appreciate circumstances she wouldn't have chosen suggested a humility that had been notably absent during our marriage. "I'm glad it's working out," I said sincerely. After we finished coordinating Tommy's weekend schedule, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where I had lived for over a decade. The same streets, the same houses, yet everything felt fundamentally different. Not just because of Victoria's absence, but because of my transformed understanding of my own strength and worth. The woman who had told her friends I was too weak to fight for anything significant had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for proving the opposite. The prenup clause she never read had become the foundation of a fair settlement that protected both my relationship with Tommy and my financial future. Most importantly, her betrayal had forced me to recognize capabilities I had always possessed, but rarely needed to exercise. The quiet strength that had seemed like weakness to Victoria had proven more durable than her flashy aggression, more effective than her manipulative strategies. As I called Tommy for his bedtime routine, I reflected on the unexpected gift hidden within our divorce's pain, the discovery that I had never been too weak at all, but simply too patient, too trusting, and too focused on preserving harmony to recognize when those qualities were being exploited. The divorce lawyer's reading of our prenup clause had changed everything, not just the legal outcome, but my understanding of my own worth and capabilities. Victoria had been wrong about me in ways she was only beginning to comprehend, while I had been right to trust in careful preparation and principled response over dramatic confrontation. The clause she never read had ultimately read her perfectly, revealing character flaws she had hidden beneath surface charm while protecting strengths in me she had never bothered to understand. What a powerful story of justice served through careful preparation and unexpected revelations. Nathan's journey reminds us that quiet strength often proves more enduring than flashy aggression, and that sometimes the protection we need comes from sources we least expect. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later discovered their mistake? Or perhaps you've experienced a moment when careful preparation paid off in ways you never anticipated. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more explorations of justice, resilience, and personal strength. Each week, we share stories that remind us never to underestimate the power of patience and principle. Don't forget to like this video and hit that notification bell. Your engagement helps our community grow and brings these meaningful stories to more people who might need them. Thank you for joining me today. Remember, sometimes the most important clauses are the ones people never bother to read until it's too late. Until next time.